wishes.
Wait one
You
second.
only have one candle, I'm sorry.
I wish my husband would stop embarrassing me.
Where are you sitting? I was told to sit here by my guest.
She's taking over.
Good.
She's telling me what to do. So thank you all very much for coming for this special occasion, for my new acquisition of Rose Marie Prins, this mixed media work called Leaving Terra Firma with Leaf, and the accompanying book that called A Leaf in the Wind. Happily, Rose Marie is here to talk to us about it.
Wonderful.
So, Rose Marie, please.
Well,
tell us.
first of all, thank you, Ina, thank you, Steve, for your generosity, yes. And thank you all for coming. This period of my life started in early 2016 with a grant from Creative Pinellas that allowed me pretty much to do whatever I wanted with the money. So, most grants you can't do that. So I decided I've always wanted to go to India, so I made plans to travel to India. And then, on September the 10th of 2016, I got the news that my son had died suddenly. And so, of course, I still went to India. I arrived just before Christmas Day, 2016, but with a broken heart. So my plan in India was to do something that I had been planning on doing for a long time, and it was consistent with what I'd done in my work for the past few years, which was, one work was called Sanctuary. It was a mixed media, multimedia actually, installation. Another piece was, there was another piece simultaneously here in St. Petersburg, also a multimedia installation called Homeland Lost and Found. So I was going to kind of move in those directions of doing something relating to the environment, something relating to social issues, something like that. But when I got to the Sanskriti Kendra in New Delhi, India, early in the morning, it was covered with smog. You couldn't breathe. But it was, in a way, a sanctuary in the middle of New Delhi, because the lands, the property was so beautifully cultivated, so beautifully cared for, and it did become my sanctuary for 2 weeks. And so instead of doing what I had planned to do initially, was to work on the terrible pollution in the Yamuna River and do a project around that. Yamuna River is one of the most polluted rivers in the world. I ended up working with those trees on the property at the Sanskriti Kendra. They spoke to me of resilience, of tenacity. They survived in spite of the pollution, in spite of the drought. They hung in there. And so they were a model for me in my grief to be more like them. So very shortly after I arrived in India, I was walking on the property, and it was twilight. The stars were just coming out, and I saw this lone, bright pink lotus bloom, of course in its dark pond, and it was glowing as if it had been illuminated from within. And so that was like an epiphany for me. It was, okay, this is what I'm going to be working on. The things that grow on this property. So I got the groundsman to help me get leaves from the trees. I couldn't climb up high enough for some of them, and I picked leaves from all of the trees, and I carefully documented them, what their names were in Hindi and English and all the rest of it. And I started working with the leaves. And that is one of them. But that came later. So first, my oil paints had been confiscated en route from United States to India. Oh. So I didn't have my art supplies, 23 tubes. So I found a source for handmade Indian paper. I went to the market and I bought something called acrylic medium, and I used the soil on the property, this gorgeous golden soil, to paint with. So I sieved it and baked it to remove impurities, and then I used that to make art with on this lovely Indian handmade paper. And so once I had the background, the ground laid down with the soil, then I took these leaves and I carefully traced around them, and then I painted in the lines, within the lines, and I made 18 pieces like this over time. I didn't get them all done in India, but I did some in India, some here, some in Mexico, but I got them done. And then I showed them at Studio 620 in 2017, early 2017. So I continued working with these leaves, making art, including the images in this book. For instance, this is pomegranate, where I laid the leaves down on a background of watercolor this time. This is what I did when I was in Mexico. The watercolor backgrounds were done in Mexico, and then I laid the leaves down on the watercolor grounds and painted them in all these different leaves. So there are 22 images in the book. And when I had finally, of course I had all these leaves pressed, and I brought them from India to the United States. Tell anybody. And I had the leaves pressed, and so finally I decided, okay, that was my therapy. My therapy was to trace around these leaves and fill in within the lines. You know how they do when there's a crime scene, they trace around the body. Well, that's what I was doing. So eventually the leaves were getting a little bit tattered, and so I decided, okay, now I'm going to start incorporating the actual leaves. Oh, before I did that, I was printing with them. So I was making collagraphs here at the Maureen Arts Center. I was taking the leaves, inking them, and printing with them, making prints, again on golden grounds, but this was printing ink this time. And then I decided, okay, now I'm going to start making art with them. So prior to that, I had gotten a residency at Moulin à Neuf in Auvergne, which by the way is recently voted as the 4th most charming village in France. So I was there in the summer of 2018, and I had my Japanese mulberry paper with me, and I had charcoal, and I had, nothing was confiscated this time, but I didn't take oil paints. So I had my charcoal and my sumi ink and my mulberry paper, and the paint became the soil from the Garonne River, which ran right across the road from the Moulin à Neuf, where I was on artist retreat for a couple of weeks. So that became my soil. I went down to the river and I gathered the soil, and I incorporated it on the background, the mulberry paper, with the charcoal and the sumi ink, and I brought those back with me to the United States. And then a couple of years ago, I added the leaf to that particular piece. Has a teak leaf from India, and so that is it. And a couple of months ago, it became the possession of Edith and Steve. So that's the story of leaving.
Thank you. Thank you. That's good.
So going back in time to shortly after my son died, his widow sent me a huge envelope filled with his poems. They were estranged, and she was living in Canada, so it was very generous of her. Just things not only his poems, but also things like a teddy bear from his childhood that he saved, that his spiritual teacher had given him. So I was really grateful to her for these. And over time, I decided that I needed to incorporate these into a book. So I spent a month in Mexico Central Mexico this time, San Miguel de Allende, and or near there, and edited the poems, and worked with the leaves, and ultimately, summer of 2020, this book was published, A Leaf in the Wind, poems by Jaro Majer, artwork by Rose Marie Prins, with 21 of my son's poems and 22 of my images. And to my son, Jaro Majer, in memoriam. I can't read it. You'll have to read it for yourselves. There's some books over there. But I will read one of his poems, 3 of his poems, if I can get through them. It just hits me sometimes. So, I'm going to start with a poem called Learning. I learn forgiveness from the tree that always bears fruit, even for the kids who carve into its bark and throw rocks at its apples. I learn detachment from the sun that turns seawater to clouds, then rains the water down again without staking claim. I learn everything from the mirror that, like God, reflects the world as its object, yet remains different from the object it reflects. The mind reflects the universe like a dirty mirror. If tarnished, cleanse your mind, purify it, keep it completely under your self-control. Then your heart, which is God, will talk to you. You, whose nature is knowledge and bliss. So that's one of them, and then I'm going to read a poem that he wrote when he was living in a spiritual community up in the Catskills. Actually, most of these were written in the spiritual community, but this one was actually written for a woman who was living there at the time. Her name was Andrea, and after he passed, she sent me this poem, for which I was very grateful, but it was written on her birthday in 1997, and it's called As Each Moon Passes. As each moon passes, you get brighter. When the cycle is in motion, there are oceans of life. Each wave that arises forms a unique existence, playing and frothing on the surface. When the wave subsides, its unity is as apparent as a rose in a field of daisies. In this way, you never grow old or die, but remember what you always were. As each moon passes, you get wiser. When the sands of the desert take hold of a breeze, there is in creation a seemingly separate existence dancing in sync with the air current, twirling in whirls of enjoyment over the calm substratum of sand. When breeze merges with sky, sand falls into union as if it had never left. In this way, you dance out your life to the beat of the spanda until one day you fall into the vast space of love. Spanda is a Sanskrit word for throb. As each moon passes, you get fuller. On the path of the siddhas, you traverse over mountains and through woods to your grandmother's house, for you are missed and deeply longed for. When you arrive, she will hug you so tightly, your bodies will meld into one. As each moon passes, you get closer to the place that waits for the sleeper to waken, bright and full, for the sun of your soul is never extinguished.
Really beautiful.
And there's one short poem that I'm going to read, very short. It's called Similes, and he sent this to me in an email on Thursday, June the 17th, 2004. Love, like spring blossoms, grows singing, like summer sun illumines, like autumn trees colors, like winter's purity pervades, like seasons turning changes. Love, ever the altar to which I bow. Does anybody have any questions?
Was your son published at the time, or did he just do his poetry on the side?
He lived in New York at the end of his life, and he participated in some poetry slams. And one slam, poetry slam at the Upper East Side, right, some fancy place. They were so impressed by him, by his poise and his presentation and the verse itself, they asked him to come back and be the featured poet.
Oh, wow.
So,
He was very handsome.
he was tall and handsome, yes, and charming. He also had a mental disability. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, so that also colored his perception of some things, of course. But months later, I asked him when I was with him in Boston, actually, why he hadn't pursued that opportunity to come back as the featured poet. And he said, I don't want to be known in that way. So that was a consideration, you know, when I was publishing his poems, that he didn't want to be known in that way. And yet, the fact that his wife had sent me the poems and everything just seemed to fall into place, I felt like I had to do that to honor his life. So he's known in that way now.
What was his name again, Rose Marie?
His name was Yaroslav. His father was Czechoslovakian, and Yaroslav means in praise of spring.
Beautiful.
So, but he preferred the name Jaro, so we all just called him Jaro, it was easier. And only when I was angry with him, when I said, Yaroslav! Yeah.
Well, that was wonderful. I think it's time for tea. And the tea is here, and I would like you all to help yourself with the tea, and help yourself with the cookies or whatever you want. And that's the next stage.